What's happening, gang? You are live back in the Secret Stash. I'm your host, Jesse Ibanez, co-founder of the Greenhouse Group. We're located right down over here in the heart of San Diego, Antonio. We got, you might say, moving folks into or out of homes is what we do. And moving those people with purpose is who we are. And so if you happen to be in the market right now, you're thinking about maybe cashing in on this summer swell of prices we've been experiencing, or maybe you're on the other end of it and you're trying to get into a home and you want to take advantage of these low rates. It's kind of like a buyer and seller market at the exact same time, which is kind of cool. Buy localized. Go down to our website at thegreenhousegroupinc.com, and we got a bunch of featured listings just popped up on the market, as well as different offers for helping you get into your home and all kinds of down payment assistance programs and all that cool stuff. So check us out over at thegreenhousegroupinc.com. Now, in the studio live today, we got Antonio Maldonado, and we're going to try to wrap our hands around this big conversation, Antonio, in a very small amount of time here, 1 hour here with you, about business relations between the two across the border.
Sure.
Okay? A lot of integrated complexity.
Yes.
Which is, of course, why you not only have a job, but you have two law degrees, one from the United States and one from Mexico. Right. And so thinking about doing business in Mexico, cross-border business, the one thing that is I think, most germane to people when they think about, the whole fallout of the NAFTA and everything is outsourcing. Right. So there's a couple rules to the outsourcing game.
Sure.
And I was wondering if you could help me with that. If there was 3 rules, what would rule number 1 be?
Well, rule number 1 would be make sure who your partner is. If you have a partner in Mexico, you want someone who has experience, who's been doing this for a long time. And so, make sure that it's not someone that's new.
Yeah, and it sounds so basic, but, I think if you could maybe expound on that a little bit, like, how do you know who?
Well, there's a Economic Development Corporation in Tijuana. There's several similar entities or organizations throughout Mexico that can help.
So being able to corroborate with like a third party,
figuring out who are other companies here in San Diego or elsewhere in California that have an arrangement like that for contract manufacturing or subcontracting some sort of process or service down to a company in Mexico. And of course, this is as an alternative to setting up your own company in Mexico, which is, of course, a very positive thing, but it adds that much more complexity.
Yeah, and God, I mean, at the risk of talking about things that I know nothing about, there's also a whole, political structure that you would have to consider.
Sure.
Like, you can't just be Johnny Gringo and roll down there and set up shop and expect everything to go perfectly.
Well, the rules are a little bit different than what they are here in the U.S., and so you want someone who already has the experience of dealing with that day in, day out. And so in that sense, it does make sense to at least at the very outset, when you are thinking about doing business in Mexico, looking for those outsourcing relationships, those contract manufacturers, those contract servicers for what it is that you need.
Because there's no Yelp for cross-border businesses, you know what I mean? So it's like you really have to rely on the informational sources that you have.
Sure.
Dare I say the good old boy network, but you at least have to understand that it's always done through the human capital connection.
That's right.
And that's something that you help with.
Yes, and that's what good attorneys can help with. Definitely.
You'd hope so. Good attorneys is the key part of that.
That's
right. Why we got you in the house right now, Antonio. Thank you for that. So if that's rule number 1, understand the who. What's rule number 2?
Okay, the rule number 2 is having good contracts in place, limiting the liability, especially in connection with the employment liability in Mexico. Employment law in Mexico favors employees very much so. There is no employment at will. You cannot fire an employee because they're not doing their job right.
Interesting.
It can only be termination for cause. And so if, say, for instance, the business just is ramping down its production, there is no cause to terminate the employees. And so there will be employee liability there. And so if you enter into the right type of contract with these outsourcing companies, then you will be limiting that exposure. And so that's going to be very important in those types of arrangements.
I could see that being critical. I mean, just what came up for me is the obvious thing of, having a U.S. business mindset, which, come on, it's hard enough to navigate your own backyard, let alone then trying to then all by yourself figure out all the different rules that apply and trying to set up your own game down there. So the outsourcing would be critical to especially a small business's success.
Right. That's
that
very
work
true.
On small margins.
And because we're here in San Diego, that's an advantage, a natural advantage of the location of where we are. The fact that it's so close. Tijuana is so close, Tecate is so close, Mexicali is so close. We have that advantage, and I think as San Diego business owners and San Diego entrepreneurs, we have to think about what are our strategic advantages, and being close to the border is one of them.
No question. I love that. Okay, so let's go ahead and say that number 2 is, making sure that you're entering into the right agreement, which is going to mitigate liability.
That's right.
I love that thought.
And I guess the third rule for going into these outsourcing relationships in connection with Mexico is the location. Figuring out where you can have supervision, where you can be close to where your business is at. Because if, let's say, for instance, if you ever try to do this with China, you're going to be a day, 2 days away from ever just visiting and figuring out how things are. And if you think telephone and voice over IP is good enough, it's really not. And so having something that's close by, having an operation that's literally across the border, a couple of minutes from here, from downtown San Diego, it's just so much easier to oversee, to supervise, to manage. And so that is, I think, the third unwritten rule about outsourcing.
What I'm thinking of, we were just actually having this conversation in the last hour when we were talking about 3D printing. But China obviously being one of the most horrendous flights you're ever going to take. It's like almost being on the plane for like what seems like 2 days. Like you fall asleep, you wake up, you fall asleep, you wake up, and you're still not there. But
True.
But the cost, of course, to do that, have that game in China is so far drastically less than if it was over in Mexico still, right? Which is still part of the challenge.
Well, here's the thing, though. Because of the rising wages in China, it's now made China much less competitive in terms of employee wages than other countries. For instance, Mexico. Right now, Chinese wages are, at least in the big cities, are pretty much on par as to what is paid in Mexico. And so it's interesting. But that competitive edge is not in China anymore. Really? And that is the reason, and that in addition to the fact that logistically it's that much easier to send goods and much cheaper to send goods from Mexico into the U.S., that many companies that were in China are now moving into Mexico or moving back to the U.S.
Gang, Antonio Maldonado Law Group. And by the way, if you're hanging out with us on Twitter at Follow the Stash, you can Meerkat. We're streaming this whole conversation live right now. You can ask Antonio any question you might have about cross-border businesses, or you can check him out and what he's doing down here in downtown San Diego or over in Tijuana at Maldonado Law Group. But that's Maldonado-law-group.com. Now, Antonio, this outsourcing game, though, are you kind of staying on top of this whole trade thing that's kind of going on right now? And so as it's maybe juxtaposed or even similar to how the current structure with NAFTA from back in, I think Clinton was when that happened, right?
That's right.
How is this going to change at all if, like in the new regime, let's just say?
Well, there's nothing concrete yet as to replace NAFTA. And that's the thing. This is something that's very valuable to the U.S. NAFTA currently creates 6 million jobs here in the U.S.
And maybe, maybe you could just back up a half a second and share for if someone doesn't understand why NAFTA is important in this even conversation in the first place.
Because a lot of the jobs that are created in manufacturing and sales and things are related to that cross-border trade that's between Canada and Mexico. And so Canada is the U.S.'s first trade partner. There is no bigger trade in the world probably than the trade that's done between Canada and the U.S.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really, really well integrated. And, it's the same time zone, same language, very similar culture. And the trade is it's just as if it's an extension of the U.S. in many senses. And so that's why there's so much trade. But then with Mexico, it's the U.S.'s third largest trading partner, second only to China.
Oh, interesting.
But China, the interesting thing, though, is that we are importing here into the U.S. tons of goods. It's billions and billions of dollars, but China isn't buying that many U.S. goods. It's not. And then the goods that we do buy have a very small content of U.S. goods. And so, for instance, every $100 that you buy of Chinese goods, they contain about $4 worth of U.S. goods in them, as opposed to Mexico that has every $100 has $40 of U.S. goods in them. And so that difference is really big, and it highlights the integration between North America, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico.
And it's Antonio Maldonado, owner of Maldonado Law Group. And now, here's the thing that I'm concerned about, is I feel like the dream of NAFTA never really ended up taking its foothold. There was supposed to be a lot of things, you might just say a lot of promises that kind of went down on both sides, and they kind of fell a little bit flat. And so let's now peek into the future a little bit. Like, do you see this now kind of being a respite for a future that's a little brighter than what we're currently experiencing?
Well, I hope so. In the sense that it's only through economic integration between North America and revamping what we already have is how the U.S. will stay competitive with Asia, China, especially Europe, and other countries. The Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It's very important that the U.S. take advantage of these natural allies that it has, and it is that cross-border trade that takes place between the U.S. and Mexico that helps the U.S. be in that competitive position.
Yeah, no question. But, how do you amplify it? Like what's missing right now in the alchemy that would then make it so?
Well, that's a great question, and I think I'm going to have to leave that to people that are really well qualified to answer that. In my humble opinion, I think that what would make the most sense is to further deepen the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. and the U.S. and Canada. I think that deepening those ties, allowing goods to move across the borders more easily is going to just help us that much more. And removing those trade barriers that still exist, even though we do have this free trade zone, there are still things that we can improve on, and that is it.
I love it, man. Thank you. Antonio Maldonado, MaldonadoLawGroup.com. So we're going to get you all caught up on some sports, up on the hard break here, mid part of the hour. Got some good scores, highlights, I'm sure a little bit of dialogue from one of our favorite gang over at ESPN. And then coming up, we're going to get into the weeds of real estate in Mexico, something I can't wait to lock down with my man Antonio Maldonado, Maldonado Law Group, in here in the Secret Stash, Real Talk Radio San Diego. We'll be right back.